In the 19th century, as the European powers scrambled for Africa, European maps of the continent were characterised by empty white spaces. The largely empty maps of the period presented Africa's interior as uncharted territory, a no man's land, as it were, awaiting exploration and conquest. European maps of Africa had not always been as empty. The continent was only gradually unmapped. In the 17th century, there were no blank spaces on the maps. On Willem Blau's famous map of the continent from 1630, there were no empty gaps to fill. Africa appeared on a par with Asia and Europe. All of the continent was divided into sovereign states. Following 2 centuries of marine exploration, Europeans knew the coastal regions well. Yet to map the continent's interior, they had to rely on the reports of others. European mapmakers drew heavily upon Greek and Arab authorities. Following Ptolemy and other ancient authors, they placed the sources of the Nile at the feet of the legendary Moon Mountains. However, in 1689, Vincenzo Coronelli announced that he had doubts about Ptolemy's account. Coronelli removed the sources of the Nile and filled the emptiness with a written note. Guillaume Delisle, a French royal geographer, followed Coronelli and suppressed the sources of the Nile. He also shaded a lake in East Africa to indicate he was not sure about the precise location. Delisle's second map of the continent was even emptier than his first. Africa was increasingly being unmapped, but there were still no cohesive blank spaces. French geographers led the field, and the rest of Europe followed suit. The map of Johann Matthias Haase is one example. It was largely an adaptation of Delisle's work. Jean-Baptiste d'Anville, another French royal geographer, declared he would remove anything uncertain. Distrustful of indigenous reports, he produced a mostly empty map of the continent. Thanks to d'Anville's reputation for accuracy, his map of Africa set a new standard. Mapmakers across Europe followed his example, producing maps with large white spaces. D'Anville had kept his faith in Greek and Arab authors. Yet others went further and only trusted contemporary European reports. Robert Wilkinson removed the sources of the Nile and left the interior emptier than ever. Apparently, British mapmakers did not trust Africans, yet they clearly trusted their own explorers. John Carey, following a report by Mungo Park, mapped a vast mountain range in the continent's interior. Mapmakers across Europe followed Carey's example. Erik Åkerland, a Swedish engraver, described Africa's interior as unknown and unfamiliar, yet he still mapped Park's mountain range. Park's mountain range was still around in John Tallis's map from 1851. Relying on Western explorers to fill the gaps in their maps, Europeans were remapping the unmapped spaces. As the European powers moved in on Africa, their efforts at exploration intensified. Eugène Andriveau Goujon produced his map of 1880, according to the latest discoveries. In November of 1884, Western leaders assembled in Berlin. Drawing lines onto a map of Africa, they divided the continent among themselves.